Now we get into the actually looking at specifics. So we're going to be spending a week, 2 weeks looking at American cultural landscapes. And this goes back to, again, the work that was done in the 50s and 60s. J.B. Jackson first, which you've got an article to read of his, that really good one on the westward moving home. And also, especially the work of Meinig. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about theory, about his list of sort of when you're almost like scoring, if you would, part of the built environment, either a structure, a place, something like that. You can actually sort of rate it in terms of his 7 sort of criteria in terms of what it does. Now, it's important to remember that for many people, including people who might build something like this, on one hand, they have some concept of what they're doing, obviously, but on the other hand, they oftentimes don't really think about the sort of complex connotations of something they put in the built environment. You flash back to what I was showing you before with that prefab sort of neo-colonial style home. I really doubt that if almost anyone that's building that or buying it, purchasing it, putting it up, really thinks through all the sophisticated analyses of what the different symbols are, how the different forms of built environment are trying to communicate to people. They know that they want it. They know that they want that. They know maybe in a vague sense what the reason for. I would assume so, since they're spending money on it. But they probably don't really understand a lot of the cultural aspects. This is the key thing. It's really important to remember about culture. When you look at people, people function within culture, but that doesn't mean they're actually aware of the dynamics of sort of if you would, the deep analysis of what particular cultural aspects are going on. So people are, in large part, pretty clueless about the more complicated aspects of their culture, and especially how it's manifested in symbol. They're aware of the symbols, they use the symbols, they read the symbols when other people are using them, but it doesn't mean they necessarily understand all the analyses or connotations of it. They react to them. But this is why if you ever do anthropology or even geography and you're looking at landscapes and you ask people, what does this mean? They'll look at you blankly and they'll start to give you some stuff. But then if you actually, well, what about this? It turns out that when you actually point stuff out, they understand what it is, but they never thought of it. So people function within culture, but they're not always cognizant of large parts of the culture. It's in part because it's normative. It's just the way they think the world operates. So why should you why should you analyze what a McDonald's is? It's just a McDonald's. So when you're looking at this idea of American cultural landscapes, what Meinig was doing back in the 70s was actually looking at the key American landscapes, the landscapes that really identified the United States and identified to Americans what was an American landscape. And one of the ways that you do this is if you just show people images. Some images will resonate with them. They'll say, "Oh yeah, this is American," or this is who we are," and stuff like that. Others will be, this could be in the United States. This could be maybe a regional part of the United States, but it's not an American thing. So what he was looking at was, what are the actual cultural landscapes, the built environments that identify the United States to contemporary Americans? And by this, obviously, I'm sort of the Euro-American package. And there's several parts that are really interesting. And one is, again, as I mentioned last time, this contrast with Europe and even to a certain extent Canada. And this is so looking at this, we're going to be going through a series in terms of time, like oldest to newest. We're just going to bounce off some of the really key ones. Again, there's others that are regional, but they're not really that powerful. If you actually want to flash back to that, the earlier presentation we were looking at for a little bit, I was looking at showing you Christmas card images. That's actually a really good example because Christmas cards are consumed all across the United States. And yet the images are, many of them are very peculiar, what you might call sort of New England colonial, which, wasn't part of the majority of Americans' life experience, even say 1800, much less in 2020s. But it resonates. Other more accurately historical images would probably not resonate to the same extent. So first off, what are the unique aspects in terms of the American built environment / cultural landscape? One of the really key ones, and this has become a huge problem in the 21st century with the growth of urban areas, the expansion of the city, the sort of, amoeba-like move of suburban, like we see here on Oahu. This is one of the key aspects of this, and one of the really interesting differences between us and Europe and Asia and just about anywhere else, well, maybe also we have in common with Canada, we don't, for example, with Mexico, is that there's not really any positive interest in the urban of the city. For Americans, the urban and city it has advantages, but it's not as seen as where you want to be. Now there are a few exceptions. People might go to New York, but you don't see people talking about retiring to New York. And if they have a lot of money, they leave New York and move into suburban areas like, say, northern part of New York State. So what you find is in the United States, there's no sense that the urban or city is good. The urban and city might be a necessity, but it's not a good thing. So there's no positive part of that. And that's a huge part when it comes to planning and other issues. We see it here, for example, in discussions about what to do with the island of Oahu and things like housing. Americans, especially in the late 20th century, became fixated on the idea that housing meant an individual residence. And that had to be a freestanding residence. Couldn't be a townhouse, couldn't be a condo, had to be a house. And this actually goes way back. And you have to remember, a lot of this has to do with the fact that the United States was settled by migrants. And so right through into the late 19th century, there was a sort of this mythos that you would move to the United States. And if you went west, there would be open space and you could build your own house, have your own land, and be your own person. So again, this individualism, building your own place, again, individualism, success, hard work, efforts, again, the whole Calvinist thing. Cities didn't allow you that. Cities were, high rises or, urban conclaves. You couldn't manifest a lot of the stuff that meant you were trying to be successful. You couldn't own things. There wasn't the same expression of individualism. And so what you find is in the American system, there was and largely still isn't any real positive about the idea of the city or urban areas. This is in radical contrast to most societies, especially in Asia, where the city is where you want to be. The quintessential example of this would probably be South Korea, where if you don't live in or around Seoul, the capital city, you're sort of, you've immediately lost points. Certainly true in much of Europe. You live in or near urban areas. And if you make money, you actually move into urban areas. So there's a very positive aspect. If you really want to get ahead, you really want to be successful, you want to have status, you do it in the city. The United States has got the reverse of that. The city is something where you make money so you can leave the city. There's a missing dichotomy then between urban and rural. And most of the world, what you find is people in rural areas, the concept of farmers, for example, is oftentimes traditionally tied to the idea of peasant. Certainly true in China and Japan. And so if people want to get ahead or people do start to get ahead, you move into the city because the city was the center of sophistication, style, social networking, education, medicine, all the rest of this was always in the city. And so the urban was what you wanted to go for. That was the goal. And that still is in most of the world. A quintessential example would be the Philippines and Manila. So, getting ahead meant going to the urban and getting out of the rural. In the United States, what you had is if you don't have the urban as a magnet or draw, then the urban rural doesn't really play off against each other the same way. So there's sort of the dichotomy isn't there. There isn't, for example, a counter move which says that you move from the urban to the rural. What you do is you move to the fringes of the urban, i.e. the suburban area. So, small town America really doesn't have a European counterpart, for example, in terms of a positive. Small town Europe, France, England, Germany, or something like that was something people want to get out to and go to the big city, Munich or Paris or London or something like that. So the small town is just something that you have as a negative, which you see quintessentially in European literature, film, etc. In the United States, small town America is still seen as the center of our identity. Look at the elections when you first place you do your pre-election test, or places like Iowa, and people go bounding around and hang out in small towns. Very, very American. The theme of the yeoman farmer, again, this is the quintessential, it's a European thing, particularly the Brits, but the Calvinists really emphasize this to an enormous extent with our idea of individualism, which is the idea that every person should own property and own their house. And that means they're going to be responsible and work for the good of the group because we're all in it together. But we're all in it together as a cluster of individuals. We're not in it together as a group. So the idea of the yeoman farmer, which sort of the quintessential example is in the British image, would sort of be, say, Robin Hood. when the British elites tried to take that away. So the yeoman farmer is a big part of sort of the image of English society. But the reality is Americans actually are much more of that. And to a large part, a lot of your population that leaves places like England, Scotland, Ireland, and such are folks that want to follow that yeoman farmer goal, but they feel like they can only do it in the United States as migrants versus in the home country where there's a more traditional system of control. So a lot of folks that move to the United States with some version of this, I want this for the yeoman farmer. Now, again, because the Calvinists come here in the 1820s, and the Calvinists, of course, are the quintessential example of all this, then they immediately lay this on the idea to the monarchy and basically convince the monarchy that if you want to have a stable political entity here in Hawaii under the Hawaiian royal family, then you're going to do it with Hawaiian yeoman farmers. And this is one of the great reasons behind the Mahele in the 1840s, is the idea that, the Calvinist missionaries, as they're educating the Hawaiian elites, educate them also in the great positive value of a stable political economic workforce that's the individual landowner with a whole. This is still a huge part of the image that we have in the United States in general. It's still very explicit here in Hawaii. Think of the difference between living in Kapolei in a home and living in part of a high-rise in Kakanako. Those people are not seen as the same. Next is really important to understand, this is my area especially, is that when we move from period to period of time, when we move from the colonial to the Wild West or something like that, it's important to remember that the old, we'll see this, icons and symbols from past periods don't get completely replaced. They get reinterpreted and oftentimes they persist. And so what you do in many cases is you add new symbols to, if you would, the box of Lego symbols that you have that make up the American image. You don't throw out the old box and put in a new box, you add new parts to it. And in many cases, you reinterpret the old parts. And so it's one of the fascinating aspects when you get into this is when you look at an American landscape in the 2020s, is that American landscape still in many cases, a lot of it refers back to some sort of prior, symbolic referent to an earlier period of time. And again, you have to remember this in large parts because cultures are conservative. Cultures are always going to refer and justify themselves in their past, not a real past, but an imagined past. And this is a huge part of what makes them what they are. And if you're in this business, it's what makes them fascinating. So seeing which of these symbols are persistent, and also which of these symbols get reinterpreted is really a classic example of cultural landscapes and built environments. We'll see this in the American ones. Notice also how we oftentimes, I think, especially in the design, there's sort of an attitude that objects, light fixtures, furniture like couches, tables, chairs, whatever, are in large part functional. In other words, they serve a light fixture's function is to light up a room. A chair's function is for you to sit in it. But when you're looking at built environment, we went over this a little bit before, you have to remember that the importance of the object isn't the symbol. It has in some cases, has very little to do with the functionality. And again, I know you're already tired of it, but refer back to that home, the prefab home in Florida, the white one, with a totally, sort of the gabled structures that really serve no function. That's a bad design from a functional standpoint, but it makes perfect sense from a symbolic standpoint. And as we go through these, one of the things we're going to see, and right from the colonial period, is that functionality was never and still isn't a huge part of why people do stuff. People do stuff for symbolic purposes. If you ask them why, they can explain. They can oftentimes rationalize it functionally. But when you actually look at it from sort of an engineering or physics or some other standpoint of measures, you find that that's not a very compelling argument because there'd be a lot of other ways to do it that would actually serve a much more functional purpose. So these are all parts that are unique to the United States. Other societies have some of these. Most societies don't have most of them, and some societies don't have any of these. They have their own set. I've never seen a lot of good work done on, say, a list like Meinig's for, say, Japanese or Chinese society, though it'd be easy enough to do. But these are the American ones. And one of the things you find sort of interesting here is if you look at the the built environment here in Hawaii from, say, the late 19th centuries, say, 1880s to 2020s, is how more and more we have become entirely embedded within the classic American images that you see here.